Pleasant good day, everyone. And my name is Dr. ABC, Dr. Andrew B. Campbell, and it is my pleasure in sharing this series with you and walking you through or guiding you through this series, Introduction to EDI in Schools. And so we're going to get right into it. Our first section today, our first conversation today is centered around creating, fostering, and sustaining intentional spaces of belonging. And how do we do that within our schools? And what is the intention of this particular series? So the intention of this particular series is for us, all of us as educators, educational leaders, for all of us to think about our work, our relationships with each other, and how we are going to work together as educators, as educational leaders, as staff, as parents, as students, the entire community. How will we work together with each other to ensure that we are creating more equitable spaces, equitable schools? And this will be led, or should I say fueled, by kindness, compassion, and empathy. And I want us at this very minute, as we're starting this very early discussion on EDI, to center the discussion around relationships. What we find is that a lot of spaces out there have centered their discussion around policies, and they're centered their discussion around framework, and they're centered their discussion around strategic planning, and they're centered their discussion around, new ideas. All of that is extremely important. But what is even more important than that is centered on our conversation and our ideas and our work around building relationships. So as we're doing this three-part series, this is the first video in the series. I want us to always think about, how do we see ourselves? How do we see each other? And how do we create better relationships? I want us to really think about that. So when I do this topic, one of the first questions I always ask this question, and I say to people, think about your school, think about where you work, think about your present school, and ask yourself, what elements of the school help you to confirm that you belong here? What are the things that help you as an educator, as a principal, whatever role you're playing? What are the things in that school, in that very building, that allows you to say, I belong here? And if we were doing this live, and I would ask you to engage and make a list, and I want you to do that. I want you to interact with me as we're going along, even in this video. And when I do that, people list a lot of things. People list a lot of things that allow them to know that they belong. People list things like people calling their names, people calling them by their names, pronouncing their names properly, a parking space, the greetings, the good mornings, the wave, the hello, the smiles. And whenever I do this workshop, these are always the things that come up, what we consider to be the little things. But the little things are the things that allow us to say, I belong here. Now, something I want to say to you is that those are the things that allow you and I to feel like we belong here. Some of those very things are the things that allow other people to feel they do not belong here. So we have somebody saying, well, you call me by my name, you pronounce my name properly. But how many of our students and how many of our persons we have relationships with that have felt marginalized, pushed aside, ignored because of the pronunciation of their names? They feel like you didn't take it into consideration. It was not appreciated. It was not respected. It was not given the same kind of sense of belonging. And so that is why I want to start here, for us to think about the things that we do in our schools, in the building, that say to people, you belong here, and say to another set of people, you do not belong here. And remember, we don't say it. You don't have to say to someone, you don't belong here. The very way that you have made no preparation for them, the very ways in which their identities are ignored or removed, the very ways that they have become invisible, the many ways in which you say to them, I don't see you. Those are the things that say to someone, I do not belong here. And we see things like the lack of representation. We see things like in the curriculum, we see the lack of culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. We see a lot of stuff, and we're going to get into that in a minute. So the last time I did a conversation, I remember I did a conversation. I was interviewed for a podcast, and I made this very statement. And I said, too many of our students are made to feel like they are strangers in schools, as if they are interrupting something. Let students feel that the classroom is theirs. And I want us to think about that as educators. Are we allowing our students to really feel that they belong into our classrooms? They are part of the classroom. They are part of the decision-making process in the classroom, and they own the classroom. Are we doing that? Are we doing that? And so I want us to really, really give that some consideration as we are doing this work. So what are we going to look at? I wanted to engage in a reflection of a personal journey. We're really going to talk about our personal journey of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Examining the indicators of belonging. Look at the theoretical context of belonging. And certain words I want us to kind of center today: safe spaces versus brave spaces versus what I call safer spaces. I need to make a correction on that. That I consider to be safer spaces. I want us to ask ourselves those things. And then we want to look at belonging and accountability within institutions. And then, of course, absolutely, we want to look at the actions that we have used to intentionally create spaces of belonging. And I want us to really center on the word intentionally, because spaces of belongings are not just created. They are not magical. They don't just happen. Someone has to create those spaces. And that is why I use the word fostering and sustaining. This morning I was having a walk with a pal this morning, and I was talking about how do we create, just the idea of creating. And then I went into the idea of building, and I went into the idea of sustaining. And then we talked a little bit about the idea that many of us, we always have a great idea, and we are easy to create. We are easy to formulate. We live in a place where people have great ideas. I think the challenge we have is, how do we sustain that? How do we sustain the work? Because when it comes to the work of equity, we have seen where many people have gotten maybe I would say the honest realization that doing the work of, we like to use certain words like disrupting and dismantling. Doing the work of disrupting and dismantling is indeed heavy lifting. And as soon as a lot of persons realize, wow, this is not something you could just tweet about and, make a placard and hold up a sign, or make a post on social media, or share something, or read a story, or, sing a song, and it's over. It doesn't work like that. Disrupting the inequities in our school, creating spaces, making sure that we understand what is it that when we say one size does not fit all, what is the root of that? What are the things that are at the root of this kind of statement? Why are we saying that? Why do we need to remind ourselves? Why do we need to remind our peers? Why do we need to remind fellow educators that one size does not fit all? Why? It's because so many of what we do in our schools are rooted in colonization, colonial practices, rooted in racism as well, rooted in anti-Black racism, in homophobia, in Islamophobia. So many of these things rooted in just what I can consider to be unkindness, the lack of empathy. So, we're not going to go into some of these concepts just now, but I want us to center belonging. And if you're going to center belonging, you also have to center the ways in which people have been excluded. the ways in which people have been marginalized, the way in which people have not been granted access within our school system. Ask yourself, who are the persons who have been marginalized? Who are those students not being given full access? What are the ways in which schools have traditionally, historically, systematically disengaged, disenfranchised, and marginalized certain students? So I love this picture. I'm sure many of you have seen it before. I've used it many, many times. And I always say to myself, there are certain students who have failed on arrival in our schools. They have failed because of our stereotypes. They have failed because of our assumptions. They have failed because of the ideas and the single stories we have about certain students. And that is why I invite us to start this as a personal journey, asking yourself, how do I see certain students? What are the negative, what are the assumptions I have made? What are the unconscious biases operating within our schools? And when I say operating, I want you to understand that these unconscious biases that we sometimes hold and have, they operate. They allow us to make certain decisions. They impact and influence our decision. That is why unconscious bias needs to be addressed. Because when they are left unaddressed, they continue to disenfranchise, marginalize, exclude, close the door on, erase certain identities, certain positions, certain persons, certain voices. So I want us to ask ourselves that. So when I think of belonging, I love this graphic. When I think of belonging, I think of a number of very, very important factors. When I think of belonging, I think of a number of important factors. And some of those factors include connections. And I have to spend some time on this diagram because what I find is that a lot of persons are doing a lot of work in equity, but we are not making connections to the people. We're not using that empathy. We're not using what I consider the I see you philosophy to make great connections. And when we don't make connections, what we do, we have symbolism and we have tokenism. So when we do not have great connections, we have symbolism and we have tokenism. We have performances because you're not truly connected. And then when you're not truly connected, there is a lack of trust. If I'm not connected to you, if I don't feel like you see me, if I feel like you're using me, if I feel like it's just a performance, my trust for you will be erased, will be fragile, will be broken. How many of our students do not trust us? Those are the honest questions we have to have. I'm sure when you hear about equity, diversity, and inclusion, you hear a lot about courageous conversation. That's a thing, right? We're building courageous conversation. But really, what is a courageous conversation? Let's have one of those. And so when you build that trust, we're looking at inclusion. We're going back to the powerful word relationships that I started with today. We're going to things of understanding who we are, the identity, and realize that none of us is any one single thing. We are made up of so many intersections. And then there are also intersections, but there are also ideas of intersectionality. Two different things, not to be mistaken, because many times we use the word intersections and intersectionality as if they are the same. They are not the same. So I wanted to think about that also as a parking lot conversation. Intersections and intersectionality, two different things, okay? And then the word safety is a popular word being used in our schools. This is a safe space. I am creating a safe space. The board is ensuring we are creating safe spaces. But what is a safe space? I've been asked many times, do I feel safe? Certain place, and I said to them, no. I've said to people in institutions, in schools, in universities, I do not feel safe as an immigrant Black man. I do not feel safe in many spaces. But in many of those spaces, I feel brave. So we have to talk about brave spaces. It's not a word that we talk about a lot. I want us to have those conversations about brave spaces versus safe spaces, or how do we use brave spaces to create safer spaces. So as we're having this initial conversation, I want you to be taking notes, and I want you to look at the kind of conversations you may want to have within your schools, within your staff meetings, within your group meetings, within your grade level meetings, within yourselves, within your family, within your homes. Because who you are is how you lead. Equity is not something you take up and be like, well, you know what? Today I'm going to do equity. Tomorrow I'm going to be too busy for equity. Next week, Monday, I may do some equity, but today's my equity day. It doesn't work like that. Equity is who you are. You have to embody those qualities. This is why when I started the conversation, I was very intentional to say, I want to start from kindness. I want to start from compassion. I want to start from love. I want to start from empathy. These are not words that are often used in the work of equity, but these words are important. When people say, I do not feel, when people say microaggression and hatred and Islamophobia and homophobia and anti-Black racism and all these anti-Indigenous and anti-Semitic, all these things, when these things happen, it is coming from a place of hurt and harm and hatred. And we have to understand that. We have to call it out for what it is. And then a very big one about belonging is membership. How do we ensure our students know that you are a member here in the school? You are a member. How do we allow our fellow educators? We talk a lot about our students, but how do we allow our fellow educators who may be marginalized or Black and Indigenous and racialized? How do we say to those educators, you are also a member here, and here are your full rights and privileges as a member? Because so many of us are given the title as member, but we are not given the access and the privilege. We have been given the title as member, but we are not given the access and the title and the privilege. So when we do that, we want to center relationships. I want you as an educator to think about your students. Think about this. How is my relationship with my students? Do they trust me? Do they know I see them? Do I spend the time to understand who they are? Do I spend the time to understand their experiences, their identities, their history, their background? I have had tons of stories I could share where students will say, I do not belong here. And when a student says, I do not belong, immediately the next thing that follows is a disengagement from school. And when our students disengage from the learning process, then we have the failure, then we have issues, then we have behavioral issues, then we have many other issues, then we have issues in our community, issues in our family, issues in the wider society. As educators, we have a role to play in ensuring our students understand that they belong. You know, I got this quote came from the Connections. There's an article in one of the Connections, and written by Biss. And Biss says, belonging is a manifestation of deep connection. How are we building those connections? And as educators, when we have made missteps and errors and mistakes, how are we addressing those? Because I want you to understand, in the work of equity, diversity, inclusion, there are going to be some missteps. It's a learning process. It's a journey. You know, a lot of persons are disappointed in their work, quote unquote, in equity, because I think they feel like it would have been one step and magic would happen. And they are realizing it's a journey. And we're going to talk about that journey some more in our next video. But when you're doing those things, when you're called, how are we calling in and building a relationship with Black folks and racialized folks and First Nations and LGBTQIA+ students? How are we making relationships where to our students know that they belong here And I'm not going to make you invisible. I see you. How are we doing those connections? Think about that for a minute. And so one of the myth that's been going on out there for a while is that, well, some of these conversations, are not good for our kids in grade 1 or grade 2 or kindergarten because they are not there as yet. Yes, they are. They're absolutely, because from a very early age, we teach our children which one doesn't belong. Think about the ways in which we have done that in school for them to understand difference exists. Difference is not a bad word. I think a lot of us, let me kind of face you a little bit for this one. I think a lot of us as educators, we are scared of having discussions about differences. Difference exists. It's okay. I'm going to give you a quick story on that. I was in a workshop the other day, and a teacher said to me, we're talking about having conversation with our students, and a teacher shared that she was in a store, and her little son, wonderful story, our little son saw an old gentleman, a really, really old gentleman, and he said, "Mommy, that man is old." And she said, immediately I grabbed him quickly, pull him close and said, "Don't say that." And I said to her, "Why did you stop him? What did he say that was wrong?" I said, this was a missed opportunity. I want you to understand where I'm going to go with this. This was a missed opportunity for you to share with your son the beauty that is difference around us, to teach him that age, we're going to age. I would have said to him, "Yes, he's old, my darling. Your grandma is old, grandpa is old, mommy or daddy's going to be old one day, and guess what? You will be old one day." Sometimes what we have done, we're so scared. We're so scared of having these real, honest conversations. We have so many missed opportunities for learning. I've had people say to me, people who are beautiful and respectful say to me, "Hey, Dr. Campbell, I'm going to introduce you. Is it okay for me to call you a black man?" And I understand why they do that. I understand society is using, certain language, and we want to talk about equity without talking about equity. We want to talk about inclusion without talking about inclusion. We want to talk about building without talking about breaking down. We want to talk about racism without talking about, anti-racist. Or we want to talk about building an inclusive society without talking about systematic racism or white supremacy or power and privilege. These are conversations we must have. So I want us to start to think about how are we missing opportunities for really building, for really growing, for really connecting. So it's okay to talk about difference with our students. It's okay to talk about differences, but you want to speak from a place of, not from a place of deficit, but of a place that empowers our students. Empowers our student. A parent shared a very concerning story with me the other day. She said, a beautiful family. I know them well, strong family. She said her child, which was in grade 3, came home one day and she said, "Mom, I wanted to straighten my hair." And her mom is from continental Africa. I won't say which country, of course. She's not from the entire Africa. There's no such thing. She's from one particular country in Africa. And so let's say for instance, she's from Nigeria. And so she noticed her child kept saying, "My mom, you're from Africa." And she said, "Africa is a continent. Your mom is from Nigeria." And then she said, another day she came in, she didn't want, to go to school with certain food. Another day she came and she talked about her hair. And so the mom realized something is happening at school. And so she went to the school and to talk to the principal and to the teacher. And you will understand that there's certain conversations we have in school as educators that grounds one person, one particular race or people in deficit. I've been a teacher for 26 Septembers. I have heard it many times. It's happening. So ask yourself, this is where I'm here to challenge you. My job is to challenge all of us. Ask yourself, how am I having conversation about differences? Is my conversation rooted in empowering my students, all my students, or am I having conversations that are placing certain students always in deficit? The single story about the Black man, the single story about the African girl, the single story about the single mother, the single story about the single father, the single story about LGBTQIA plus people, the single story about First Nations people. How are we having those conversations? Are those conversations rooted, culturally responsive, respectful, or are those conversations rooted in deficit language? So I want us to be very careful when we ask ourselves those things. So when we have this very conversation about belonging, one of the questions I ask people, have you ever felt in a space that you did not belong and the reason why, and what are those indicators? And people listed things, and they listed many things, and they listed not being acknowledged. That is why I talk about I see you a lot. One of my personal philosophy, I talk about I see you. The looks and the stares. If you don't walk in a certain body, you won't understand when people said what the looks and the stares mean, when they are followed in stores, when a racialized person tells you they are being followed in a store. If they're going to steal something, you have to understand. And then the first thing some person will say, well, that doesn't happen to me. That shows me that you're lacking the cultural competence we need you to have, because you have to understand that these kind of things systematically happen to certain population, certain bodies, racialized bodies, Black bodies. So I want you to ask yourself the micro and the macroaggression, the questioning, the need to qualify why you are here. The need that a heightened level of surveillance. You have heard a heightened level of surveillance and security when you are in the room. It says to me, I do not belong. So ask yourself these questions. And this is a very early discussion. For us to get deeper into that, we have to engage into some other activities and conversations about belong, which I hope one day we'll have. So I love this quote from DeWitt, 2018. No one should spend a day in an environment where they do not feel safe. The lack of safety these students felt was partly due to the perceptions of their teachers, which contributes to a hostile school climate. I talked about this before. Are we setting an inclusive culture and climate? Are we setting a space in our schools that say to our students, you belong here. Come in this building, in this board, you belong here. So as we ask ourselves, who determines who belong? We have heard the cliche, we've heard it a lot, it becomes a cliche now. A seat at a table. You hear this quite a bit. A seat at the table. Ask yourself, when you give that person a seat at the table, what access do they have? What right and privilege do they have at the table? Because I've seen seats at the table that are tokenized. We only put you at the table because we want the world to know we have a Black person at the table. We have a racialized person at the table. We have an hijab wearing person at the table. We have a female at the table. We have someone who has a disability in a wheelchair, or somebody in a wheelchair at the table. We have somebody who's on the autism spectrum at the table. And we only do that for token. It's not authentic. It's not genuine. Who determines who belongs? Here's one of my favorite questions. I mean, I create the question, but here's one of my favorite questions. What does belonging look like here? Ask yourself. And I like to add to that, what does care look like in your classroom? Especially as a Catholic board, Catholic school that subscribes to certain principles of Christianity. What does kindness look like in your school, in your classroom? What does care look like in your school, in your classroom? Is it different levels of love and kindness? Do our teaching allow us to see one person as deserving and another person as not deserving? We need to ask ourselves these questions because we like to sidestep these questions. We like to hide from these questions. Does our religion say to us, treat this person good, treat this person inferior. This person belongs, this person does not. This person gets access, that person does not. Give this person kindness and love and forgiveness. Do not give this person this. I want us to ask ourselves, what does belonging look like in your classroom? How do we create safe spaces in our schools? I just want us to kind of really, I would say, munch on those words, munch on those questions. Yeah, that's a good one. Munch on those for a little bit. Take your time. How do we create safe space in our schools? And if you're big on creating safe space, then you have to be honest about who is not feeling safe. I see a lot of people do that. We're going to create a safe space, but they don't want to discuss who is feeling unsafe. It's not authentic. You cannot create safe spaces if you don't know who you're creating them for and why you're creating them. But we have to have those courageous conversations. You know, the metaphor of a classroom as a safe space has emerged as a description of classroom climate that allows students to feel secure enough to take risks, to share who they are, to honestly express their views and share and explore their knowledge, attitude, and behaviors. Safety in this sense does not refer to a physical space. We're not talking about hold and secure. We're not talking about a shooter in the building and let's get on that deck. We're talking about someone walking into that school, knowing I belong. And this quote comes to us from Ehrman, 2017. So what does belonging looks like? Belonging looks like respect. Belonging looks like positive energy, collaboration, connections, empathy. Belonging looks like time and space to share our emotions and our feelings. Belonging looks like the diversity is reflected in the classroom. Belonging looks like comfortable to be and to become. I was at a presentation last week and the theme was Dare to Be. A powerful theme, dare to be. Wow. In a world, there are people who have to dare to be, because their lives have been engaged with nothing but exclusion and disenfranchised attitude towards them. The doors have been closed on them. The doors of opportunity and access and privilege and power been closed and shut and slammed on them. And so we have to even teach people how to dare to be. It looks like representation. It looks like representation. Ask yourself about that. And so I want to talk about the power we have. I love this. I love this quote. I really love this quote about the power that we have. Creating a sense of belonging isn't just about being friendly or kind. Here comes the power we have as educators. It is about grasping the ways that some of your students experience a classroom as foreign, intimidating, hostile, and/or injurious. It's about providing a consistent psychological, intellectual, and emotional counter-narrative to the microaggression, imposter syndrome, and stereotype threat your minoritized students experience. So we want to be careful to ask ourselves, how are some of our students experiencing our classroom? We have the power to create that change. We have the power to engage in that belonging. You know, a lot of us, when we have these kind of workshops, people are moved, people are challenged, and then that's it. So I want to say to you, educators, if you watch this video today, tomorrow, next week, 100 times next year, yes, you are challenged. Yes, you feel disrupted. I hope you do feel disrupted. I hope you do feel challenged. But when you feel that, what happens afterwards? How are you moved to making changes? And so these are some of the comments in a research done by Steiner 2011 talks about, it's a research when he was talking about what belonging looks like and the reason why they felt belonging, the interaction, the respect, the feeling cared about, the interaction with their educators, being listened to and understood. These are the ways in which students felt belonging. As educators, how do we create that space? If you look at Maslow, we like to get into Maslow, need hierarchy. We see a theoretical context. We see where belonging sits in the needs hierarchy. We see, and that's why we, as educators, sometimes, I smile when we question why students do not feel safe at school or they don't feel their self-esteem is challenged. You have to understand the interaction or the relationship between safety and belonging, the relationship between belonging and self-esteem. If I don't feel like I belong, my self-esteem is, of course, it's destroyed. It's torn apart. It's impacted. It's affected. It's inflicted. I'm sick because I am in a space where I do not belong, but yet still I'm forced to be there 5 days a week, sometimes 6 to 8 hours a day. Imagine our students coming into our building every day and they do not feel a sense of belonging. Imagine the emotional impact, the mental impact. And then we question about students' mental well-being. We question about students who are being driven to do self-hurt and harm. We question the lack of self-esteem. It's almost hypocritical for us to do that when we genuinely realize we have not built it, we have not fostered, cultivated, sustained, build, plant belonging as foundational. So I love to ask this question. I'm going to go back to this first. What would happen if belonging was the foundation of what we do? Ask ourselves, what will happen if belonging, what would happen if belonging was the foundation? So I leave it to you, things that we must do as educational leaders. And when I say educational leaders, I'm not talking about the principals. I hope you know that. I'm talking about you and I. I'm talking about us. We are the leaders. We are educational leaders. Every one of us who is listening to this video, we are the leaders. And I want you to take the time out to understand who you are as a leader, so you can create safer space and sense of belonging. Leader as an ally, your role, your responsibility, your accountability, the moral courage needed to lead. Moral courage is lacking in our schools. A lot of persons do not want to get involved. They want to have a quote unquote peaceful school. You can't have a peaceful place and a great place when you are the only person who is feeling safe because of your power and your privilege. But our students are being hurt and ripped apart. How do we do that? How do we really spend time to foster, create safe and brave spaces? And how do we use, I want to talk about that the next time we come back, using equity lens in our schools. And I want to say this because I know it's a popular statement, equity lens. Equity lens are not fabulous rose-colored glasses. Equity lens illuminate the dirt. Equity lens will illuminate the things that are missing. Equity lens will show you a crack. Equity lens will bring in focus the things that are not aligned, the things that are not equitable. So I hear a lot of people talking about, oh, we're going to use equity lens. Do you understand the power of equity lens if you actually use them? Because other persons who say they are using equity lens, they are not, because they're afraid of what they will see. You can't be engaged in using equity lens and then you are afraid of what you're going to see. See it. I want you to see what is happening in your school, in your board. I want you to be aware and see it, and then be that diversity leader who is going to walk to impact change. I'm going to close with two things I'm going to invite you to do. I love this picture. I've used this picture quite a bit. And I don't, if many of us will think somebody's praying, it looks like somebody's praying for this young man. But I use it in a very symbolic way. Because for me, what is most important are the hands. The hands are more important for me. And as you think of belonging, ask yourself, how are you placing your hands on the lives of your student? How are you placing your lives on students who are First Nations, who are excluded, those immigrant kids who come to school and they are new and they are excited, but they're also afraid? Do we just put them in ESL and discard them and forget them and put piles and piles of barriers? The ones who have mental issues and emotional issues, students who are on the autism spectrum, neurodiverse students, students who identify as twist LGBTQIA+. How are we making sure our hands of care, of kindness, of empathy, of love is impacting our students so we can build the trust, the relationships, and the connections we desire? And my final thing I want to leave with you is there is a link. I'm sure a link will be shared with you. And I want all of us, as you're finished watching this video, I want you to take 2 minutes out of your time to complete the response in the link. It's not data being gathered for no project. You will get an opportunity to see the results, because I want to do a thing to review the results. So I want every single person to use the link to give your feedback. And the feedback is not for me. Now that's the catch. The feedback is for you. It's about your learning and your unlearning. The things that you're wondering about, the things that you're curious about, the things that are affecting you, the things that are impacting you about equity work, the things that you are even uncomfortable about, the things that you're struggling with. We want to discuss those things because that's how we grow. That's how we learn and we unlearn. If we push these things aside and we don't address them, then we are not growing, we are not learning. So I want to encourage you to complete that. Thank you so much for engaging in this conversation. As we have centered this conversation today, we have centered our first conversation in a journey. And the others will also come to that same journey as we are working as educators to grow, to learn and to unlearn. I want you to ask yourself, what am I learning? What am I unlearning? What actions will I take? What am I struggling with in this work of equity, diversity, and inclusion? How am I walking the journey? That is a space for us to constantly reflect in. So thank you so much for engaging. Looking forward to your responses, looking forward to your feedback, looking forward to you taking these conversations within your staff meeting and your staff room and having this conversation with your peers, having this conversation with your students, having this conversation with your community, having this conversation with school leadership. How do we create, foster, and sustain intentional spaces of belonging in our schools?